On October 26th of 2018, this defendant shot and killed 2 of his friends.
2 young men, full of dreams and ambition, stepped into a vehicle with people they trusted and never made it home alive. But the person accused of ending their lives was someone they'd known since childhood, someone they called brother, someone they'd built their entire music career with. And what he allegedly did after pulling the trigger, that might be even more disturbing than the act itself.
He killed Christopher Thomas and Anthony Williams. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to set out the story and how this unfolded, and lay out what I expect the evidence will show during the course of this trial.
These weren't random targets of gang violence or caught in the crossfire of a dispute they had nothing to do with. They were allegedly murdered by their own friend, 19-year-old Jamel Maurice Demons, better known as YNW Melly. Now, before we dive deeper into what happened that night, you need to understand who YNW Melly was at this point. This wasn't some struggling unknown artist desperately trying to make it. Melly was already experiencing massive success. His breakthrough single Murder on My Mind had gone viral on SoundCloud, amassing millions upon millions of streams. The song's haunting lyrics about killing someone and dealing with the psychological aftermath had resonated with listeners across the country. Melly had secured a deal with 300 Entertainment, one of the industry's respected labels, and was collaborating with some of the biggest names in hip-hop, including Kanye West on the track Mixed Personalities. His albums were charting, his concerts were selling out, and it seemed like nothing could stop his rise to superstardom. But success, as we've seen time and time again in the music industry, can bring out the worst in people. And according to prosecutors, tensions had been building within the YNW collective, tensions over money, over credit, over who deserved what share of the success that Melly's talent was bringing them. The victims' families would later claim that disputes over a potential brand deal worth hundreds of thousands of dollars may have been the catalyst for what happened. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that night.
First thing you are going to hear is that at 4:35 a.m. on October 26th of 2018, Cortland Henry, the co-defendant, shows up at Memorial Miramar Hospital.
It was approximately 1 a.m. when 8 young men gathered at a recording studio located at 805 Northeast 4th Avenue in Fort Lauderdale. This was supposed to be a routine session, the kind of late-night studio grind that every up-and-coming artist knows well. But according to testimony, not much productive work was getting done that night. The group was tired, the energy was off, and around 3:19 in the morning, they decided to pack it up and head home. It seemed like a simple, unremarkable decision. Everyone was ready to call it a night and get some rest. But for 2 of those young men, this decision to leave would be the last one they'd ever make. The 8 men split into 2 vehicles for the journey home. 4 individuals, Travion Glass, Dontavia Swithers, Jacoby Mills, and Adrian Davis, climbed into a red Mitsubishi SUV. The remaining 4, Melly, Sack Chaser, Juvie, and Cortland Henry, known as YNW Bortland, got into a gray Jeep Compass. According to surveillance footage from inside and outside the studio, the seating arrangement in that Jeep would prove crucial. Bortland took the driver's seat, Sack Chaser sat in the front passenger seat, Juvie was in the rear passenger seat, and Melly positioned himself in the rear driver's side seat. Everyone was heading to the same place, Sunset Lakes, a gated community in Miramar where they were all staying at the time. The 2 vehicles left the studio and made their way through South Florida's highway system, Interstate 95 southbound to State Road 595, then on to Interstate 75 southbound. Florida Department of Transportation traffic cameras captured both vehicles traveling together, following one another through the darkness. To any observer watching those grainy highway camera feeds, it would have looked completely normal, just 2 vehicles full of friends heading home after a night out. But prosecutors say that inside that gray Jeep, something was about to happen that would shock even hardened homicide detectives. Now, here's where the digital evidence becomes absolutely crucial to understanding this case. Cell phone data would later reveal that all 4 occupants of the Jeep had their phones with them that night, and investigators would use this data to track their movements minute by minute. In what prosecutors would later call a digital leash, these phones painted an irrefutable picture of where everyone was at critical moments. Interestingly, both Melly and Sackchaser used the exact same make and model of cell phone and were on the identical service plan, using the same cell towers. Juvie had an iPhone on Sprint service, and in the red Mitsubishi, Dontavius Withers also had a Sprint phone. This meant investigators could track both vehicles simultaneously and verify exactly where everyone was at any given moment. As the convoy reached the intersection of Miramar Parkway and 184th Avenue around 3:50 in the morning, something crucial happened. The red Mitsubishi turned south, heading directly towards Sunset Lakes. Surveillance footage from the guard gate at the gated community shows the red Mitsubishi pulling up and passing through at 3:50 a.m. The 4 men inside were safely home, but the gray Jeep that had been following behind? It never showed up at that gate. Instead, it made a completely different turn heading north on 184th Avenue, away from safety, away from witnesses, away from surveillance cameras. The Jeep continued north until it reached Pines Boulevard, then turned west and traveled all the way to the edge of the Florida Everglades, a desolate pitch-black area where there were no witnesses, no streetlights, no security cameras, nothing. The vehicle then headed south on US Highway 27 before making a left onto Pembroke Road, a street that doesn't actually connect through it dead ends at a trash and recycling facility. And it was here, in this isolated location, at exactly 4:02 in the morning, that cell phone records show all 3 phones, Melly's, Sackchaser's, and Juvie's, pinged at the exact same location. According to prosecutors, this is the moment when Jamel Demons allegedly opened fire on his 2 childhood friends from the back seat of that Jeep, ending their lives in what authorities describe as an execution-style incident.
They are riddled with bullets, and the car is full of blood. Christopher Thomas is sitting in the rear. There is multiple defects to his body. Anthony Williams, who is sitting in the front, has 2 major injuries. Officer Jessica Amangor is working a detail at the hospital. Cortland Henry runs in, starts telling a story about a drive-by.
But here's where this case goes from shocking to absolutely diabolical. What allegedly happened after those fatal shots were fired might be even more disturbing than the act itself. According to prosecutors, Melly and Bortland didn't immediately call 911 or rush their friends to a hospital. Instead, they allegedly spent the next 30 minutes staging an elaborate crime scene designed to deceive law enforcement and make it look like a random drive-by shooting had claimed their friends' lives.
In his car, he has 2 dead bodies. In the front passenger seat is Anthony Williams. In the rear passenger seat is Christopher Thomas. They are dead.
At 4:02 a.m., after the alleged shooting occurred at the remote location, Melly's phone shows unusual activity. His health tracking data, the kind that's automatically collected by modern smartphones, shows approximately 70 steps being taken. Then, minutes later, the same health data shows another 70 steps. But here's what's truly remarkable. Between 4:42 and 4:53 a.m., Melly's phone records show 1,397 steps being taken. What was he doing during this time? Why was he walking so much in this remote location? Prosecutors have a theory about that. They believe this is when Melly and Bortland staged the crime scene, firing additional shots into the vehicle from the outside to create the appearance of a drive-by shooting. This theory would later be supported by physical evidence that seemed impossible to explain any other way. But staging the scene wasn't the only alleged deception that occurred during these critical minutes. At 4:20 a.m., just 18 minutes after the shooting, Melly made a FaceTime video call to his girlfriend at the time, Mariah Hamilton. The call was so unusual and distressing that it woke up Mariah's mother, Felicia Holmes, who also saw Melly on the video call.
Felicia Holmes also sees the defendant, Jamel Demons, on that FaceTime video call. And you're going to learn, ladies and gentlemen, that that's a data event on a cell phone. that it's not a call for the purposes of the cell phone companies. It's using data, accessing the internet. Felicia Holmes and Mariah Hamilton see Jamel Devins outside, and he is saying he's just been involved in a drive-by.
On that video call, Melly allegedly told them that he had just been involved in a drive-by shooting and that he believed his friends Anthony Williams and Christopher Thomas were dead. Think about the audacity of that for a moment. If prosecutors are correct, this means Melly allegedly called his girlfriend and her mother within minutes of committing these acts to start establishing his alibi and his version of events. But what's particularly striking about this call, according to testimony that would later emerge at trial, is how calm Melly appeared during this conversation.
How are you today?
Not good.
Are you cold?
No, I'm just, I don't feel comfortable.
Are you nervous?
I feel threatened.
When Felicia Holmes eventually testified at Melly's trial, she described him as appearing notably calm during this video call, not panicked, not hysterical, not showing the kind of distress you would expect from someone who had just witnessed their friends being shot. Under questioning from the prosecution, Holmes explicitly used the word calm to describe Melly's demeanor. This testimony would become incredibly significant because it painted a picture of someone who wasn't in shock or traumatized, but rather someone who was composed and in control, allegedly executing a plan. During this same time period, at 4:42 a.m. specifically, Melly sent something called a drop pin to his friend Frederick Givens. For those unfamiliar, a drop pin is essentially a digital beacon showing your exact location, and Melly was asking to be picked up from this remote area. About 11 minutes later, he sent another drop pin showing that he had moved a couple of meters from his previous position. This digital trail would prove crucial because it showed that Melly had left the vehicle and was positioning himself away from the crime scene. But while Melly was allegedly setting up his alibi and arranging for a ride, what was happening with the vehicle containing his two deceased friends? For approximately 30 minutes after the shooting, the Jeep remained at or near that remote location while the scene was allegedly being staged. Then, around 4:35 in the morning, Bortland drove that Jeep, now containing two bodies, to Memorial Regional Hospital in Hollywood, Florida.
Cortland Henry runs in, starts telling a story about a drive-by. Quote unquote, drive-by. Cortland Henry, and you're going to learn a lot about Miramar geography during the course of this trial, tells a story that he and his buddies, just the two that are in the car, were at a music studio here in downtown Fort Lauderdale at 805 Northeast 4th Avenue.
Officer Jessica Amagor was working a hospital detail that early morning when Bortland came rushing in with his story. According to her testimony, Bortland was animated and agitated, repeatedly demonstrating how he had to duck down in the driver's seat to avoid being hit by bullets. He claimed they had just left the recording studio and were driving home when they were stopped at a traffic light on Miramar Parkway, somewhere between 160th Avenue, also known as Dykes Road, and 170th Avenue. He said that's when an unknown vehicle pulled up and opened fire on them, and that he didn't see the car or the shooters, he just heard shots and ducked down while trying to get away. Officer Amagor noted something peculiar when she examined Bortland. Despite the Jeep having 16 easily identifiable bullet holes, Bortland himself had no injuries whatsoever. No blood, no wounds, nothing. She even remarked to him that he was extremely lucky, given how many bullets had struck the vehicle. But at that moment, with two young men dead or dying in the vehicle, there was no reason to doubt Bortland's story. It seemed like a tragic but all too common occurrence, young men caught in the crossfire of South Florida's gang violence. But when Miramar Police Department detectives began their investigation, Bortland's drive-by story started falling apart almost immediately. Investigators shut down the entire length of Miramar Parkway, from 160th to 172nd Avenue. They walked side by side for an hour, searching that entire mile-long stretch, looking for any physical evidence of a shooting, shell casings, glass fragments, bullet projectiles, tire marks, anything.
You're going to hear that there is none of that found whatsoever.
They found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of evidence to support that a shooting had occurred on Miramar Parkway. So investigators thought maybe they had the location wrong or the time frame wrong, and they searched an additional mile from 172nd to 184th Avenue. Still nothing, no broken glass, no projectiles, no shell casings. This was a massive red flag. A vehicle with 16 bullet holes should leave behind abundant physical evidence at the scene of the shooting. The absence of any evidence whatsoever suggested that the shooting didn't happen where Bortlen claimed it did. Detectives then worked backwards, verifying that the studio address Bortlen had mentioned was indeed a recording studio and discovering that it was equipped with surveillance cameras. When they reviewed that footage, they made a crucial discovery. There were actually 4 people in the gray Jeep when it left the studio, not just the 2 victims and Bortlen. That 4th person, sitting in the rear driver's side seat, was Jamel Demon's YNW Melly. This was the first time investigators learned that Melly had been in the vehicle because he wasn't at the hospital when Bortlen arrived with the bodies. The surveillance footage was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, they began assembling what prosecutors would later call a web of circumstantial evidence that painted a disturbing picture of what really happened that night. The Jeep was towed to the Miramar Police Department substation, and crime scene technicians executed a search warrant on the vehicle. What they found inside would prove crucial to the case.
This is Detective Mark Moretti reading the search warrant for the vehicle.
The vehicle in question, what is it?
It was a Jeep Compass.
Is that the same that's indicated on that photo in the red lettered writing?
Yes.
The forensic examination of the vehicle revealed something that contradicted the drive-by story entirely. The ballistic evidence showed that the shots came from inside the vehicle, not from outside. Investigators found spent shell casings inside the Jeep, including one particularly damning piece of evidence. A .40 caliber shell casing sealed inside a white plastic bag that was found on the rear driver's side floorboard. Think about that for a moment. Why would a shell casing from a drive-by shooting end up inside a plastic bag on the floor of the vehicle? It wouldn't. But it makes perfect sense if someone inside the vehicle fired shots and then tried to collect and conceal the evidence. The bullet trajectories told an even more compelling story. Forensic experts determined that all of the fatal shots traveled from the driver's side of the vehicle toward the passenger side and from the rear of the vehicle toward the front. This matched exactly with Melly's seating position in the rear driver's side seat. Using trajectory rods, long sticks that are inserted through bullet holes to show the path of projectiles, investigators demonstrated that the shots that killed both victims came from where Melly was sitting. The autopsy findings were equally damning. Both victims died from gunshot wounds that entered from the left side of their heads and traveled to the right. Christopher Thomas Jr. had been shot in his left cheek, with the bullet traveling through his brain. This was the fatal shot. Dr. Adrian Sauter, who conducted the autopsy, testified that Thomas's heart had actually stopped beating before additional shots were fired, meaning some of the wounds were inflicted after he was already deceased. Anthony Williams had been shot in the back of the head, with the bullet exiting through the top of his skull and blowing out the front passenger window. The medical examiner testified that this was instantly fatal, and that additional wounds found on Williams's body were also inflicted after he was already dead. This post-mortem damage would become significant, because it supported the prosecution's theory about the staging of the crime scene. But perhaps the most chilling piece of forensic evidence was the presence of stippling on the victim's wounds. Stippling is unburned gunpowder that's ejected from a firearm when it's fired, and it only travels a very short distance because it has almost no mass. The presence of stippling on both victims indicated that they were shot from extremely close range, likely just 2 to 3 feet away. This was not consistent with a drive-by shooting, where the shooter would be in another vehicle several feet away. This was consistent with an execution-style incident carried out by someone sitting in the back seat. Nearly a month after the incident, on November 21, 2018, Investigators finally obtained detailed cell phone tracking data that led them back to that remote location at US 27 and Pembroke Road. When they searched that area, they found 8 additional .40 caliber shell casings scattered on the ground. These casings, combined with the one found inside the plastic bag in the vehicle, brought the total to 9 shell casings recovered, all .40 caliber ammunition. The location of these casings supported the prosecution's theory. The shooting occurred at this remote location, and then additional shots were fired from outside the vehicle to make it look like a drive-by. But there was also digital evidence that prosecutors say amounts to a confession. In the hours after the incident, as news of the deaths spread on social media, multiple people reached out to Melly on Instagram to check if he was okay. One person, rapper PZ Gambino, sent Melly a message asking, "Yo homie, you good? Let me know something." Melly's response, according to Instagram records obtained by investigators, was chillingly succinct, "I did that," followed by a shushing emoji.
And Mr. Demmons responds very succinctly, "I did that."
Prosecutors argue this was Melly admitting to the crime in his own words. The defense would later argue that this message was taken out of context, and that "I did that" could have referred to anything perhaps surviving the alleged drive-by unharmed. But combined with all the other evidence, prosecutors saw this as a clear admission of guilt. On February 13, 2019, nearly 4 months after the incident, Melly was arrested in Los Angeles while he was in a recording session. Bortlen was arrested the same day in Vero Beach. Both were charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and faced either life in prison or the death penalty if convicted. Melly pleaded not guilty, and his defense team immediately began challenging every aspect of the prosecution's case. The legal proceedings that followed would become one of the most drawn-out and complicated murder cases in recent Florida history. Melly's first trial finally began on June 12, 2023, more than 4 years after his arrest. The trial lasted for weeks, with the prosecution presenting all of the forensic evidence, cell phone data, surveillance footage, and witness testimony we've discussed. The defense, led by attorney David Howard, argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that no murder weapon was ever recovered, and that there was no clear motive for Melly to harm his childhood friends. After 19 days of testimony and over 16 hours of jury deliberation across 3 days, the jury was hopelessly deadlocked. On July 22, 2023, Judge John Murphy declared a mistrial. According to reports that emerged later, the jury had been split 9-3 in favor of acquittal on the murder charges, with some jurors leaning toward convicting on lesser charges like manslaughter. The mistrial meant that prosecutors would have to try Melly all over again if they wanted a conviction. But then, in September 2025, something happened that dramatically changed the landscape of this case. YNW Bortlen, who had been facing the same charges as Melly and was scheduled to go on trial on September 10, 2025, accepted a stunning plea deal just 1 day before jury selection was set to begin.
Do y'all feel like Bortlen's snitching on Melly?
He might be, or they don't got enough evidence of Bortlen. Yeah, that's weird. I don't know.
Yeah.
On September 9, 2025, Bortlen appeared before Judge Martin Fine and entered a no-contest plea to 2 counts of accessory after the fact to murder, 1 count of witness tampering, and 1 count of unlawful use of a 2-way communication device. In exchange for these pleas, prosecutors dropped the 2 first-degree murder charges against him, meaning Bortlen would no longer face life in prison. The deal called for 10 years in prison, followed by 6 years of probation, with credit for the approximately 4.5 years he had already served. This meant that Bortlen could potentially be released around January 6, 2032.
Mr. Henry, I'm not quite sure how your lawyers managed to do this, but I wish you good luck, sir.
The plea agreement also included a crucial component. Bortlen would be required to provide what's called a proffer, a sworn statement to prosecutors detailing his knowledge of the events. However, Bortland's attorneys were quick to emphasize that the deal did not require him to testify against Melly in court, and they insisted that Bortland was not a snitch and would not be cooperating beyond providing a limited statement about his own role.
Because there was a whole list of everything that would happen with the plea. What charges would get dropped, he would get credit for.
The terms of Bortland's plea essentially admitted that he helped cover up the murders after the fact, but maintained that he wasn't the shooter and wasn't a principal in the actual killings. By pleading no contest rather than guilty, Bortland technically didn't admit to the underlying facts of the charges, which could provide some protection in potential civil lawsuits from the victims' families. The reaction to Bortland's plea deal in the hip-hop community was swift and divided. Social media erupted with debates about whether Bortland had snitched on Melly or simply taken a smart legal deal to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison.
Nothing in it said anything about cooperating. It was just him admitting to what he did, and he would get the 16 years, and that'd be it.
What does Bortland's plea mean for Melly's upcoming retrial? That's the million-dollar question that legal experts have been debating. On one hand, the fact that Bortland admitted to being an accessory after the fact, essentially admitting that he helped cover up murders, could be used by prosecutors to strengthen their narrative that a cover-up occurred. Even without Bortland testifying, his guilty plea is a piece of evidence that could influence a jury's thinking. On the other hand, Bortland's deal also reveals potential weaknesses in the prosecution's case if they had ironclad evidence against Bortland as a principal in the murders. They likely wouldn't have offered such a lenient deal. Melly's retrial, which was originally scheduled for September 2025, has been pushed back to January 2027 due to ongoing appeals over evidence admissibility. This means that Melly will have spent approximately 8 years in pretrial detention without a conviction by the time his second trial begins. Do you think the prosecution's theory is correct, that Melly killed his friends and staged an elaborate cover-up? Let me know what you think in the comments. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.